Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, especially at 4:40 in the afternoon. Really appreciate your eagerness to hear this panel. I'm Julie Lammers, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for American Student Assistance. We are a national nonprofit. Our focus is on helping kids know themselves, know their options, and to make informed choices about their education and career goals. And we really really excited today to have this great group joining us in this conversation. To my immediate left, David Sue, Chief of Staff for JFF, Jobs for the Future. JFF is a nonprofit that drives transformation in education and workforce systems. Prior to JFF, David worked for about 7 years, I think that's right, as a policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Education. Ryan Craig, you guys actually lined up in the order I did these notes. This is great. Ryan Craig is managing partner at Achieve Partners, a venture capital firm looking to build new learning models and pathways to economic opportunity. Ryan is also the author of several books, A New You, Faster and Cheaper Alternatives to College, and College Disrupted, The Great Unbundling of Higher Education. Thank you for joining us. Jason Tyszko, is that right? Tyszko, thank you. I practiced and I failed anyway. Is the Vice President of the Center for Education Workforce at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Prior to his work at the U.S. Chamber, Jason worked for quite a while on education, workforce, and economic development issues for the state of Illinois. Pat Leonard is a Vice President of Strategic Partners and Business Development at Credly, an organization helping to create a common language for employers so that people can know to help employers, understand people's knowledge, skills, and abilities. So thank you all for joining us. This is a really exciting conversation we're going to have. To start and level set the conversation, I just want to tell you a little bit about the work that ASA is doing in partnership with JFF. We are looking to really launch a narrative change around this idea of a diversity of post-secondary education pathways. And so to begin that work, we have started with research with our partners at Morning Consult to look at the current perceptions and understanding from both an employer perspective as well as a student perspective on post-secondary education, non-degree post-secondary education pathways, how people understand them, how they value them, are they willing to actually pursue these pathways? From an employer standpoint, are they willing to hire from these pathways? And so what the high-level research points to, and you can find out more tomorrow at 10:30, I believe, if you want to look at your schedule. We're doing a deep dive on the research at that point. It really points to the fact that there is a lot of willingness and a lot of understanding from an employer perspective on what available credentials and paths exist, but that there is a reluctance to actually hire from those paths. And it really is based on a level of risk that is associated with hiring the unknown, not really understanding what the value of some of these credentials are. From a student perspective, there is also a level of risk associated there. They are less likely to pursue a path that they don't believe an employer will hire from. And so the risk associated with that is really holding them back. So some of the work that we're doing with JFF is to try to cover what those barriers and obstacles are and how can we change conversations around that work. So David, maybe I can start with you, just get at your high level of why this kind of work is a priority for JFF. We can start there.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and good to see everyone in real life. It's good to be back here at this. I've been loving seeing everyone. So JFF, as you heard, is a national nonprofit driving transformation in the education and workforce systems to drive economic advancement for all. So we really see this as economic advancement. It's an equity play, and by providing more pathways for students, it's going to be more equitable outcomes for all. So that's like what really drives us. And we work at JFF in a dual transformation framework. So we're looking at how we can work with the incumbents in the current system. We have to know the college presidents, with some of them in the room today, know the current players, the current funders, the current government funding regimes, and work within them and make them better. But we also need to think about what is the future? Like, what could the future be? And really imagine and think big and bold and think about what pathways might exist in the future. And so this project hits both of those. It starts right now by saying to students, there are a multitude of these pathways. You could take lots of different routes. It's not that big of a leap. You can do it. But it also says there should be many, many more of these. We should have much more information about the quality. We should have much more information. And what might that look like in the future? And so we're able to hit that immediate term change and then also boldly reimagine.
That's great. So, we're trying to better understand the options, but critics might say that there is too much risk in sort of reestablishing old systems of tracking when we're looking at some paths are okay for certain students and not from others. How do we minimize that and really prioritize equity in this work?
Yeah, no, equity, I mean, as I said, is the North Star for us in general and especially in this work. And it reminds me, like when you mentioned I was at the government, like when I was in government, people would often, and we were trying to push innovation, a lot of my colleagues that did not want to do things that were different would just say, you can't do that. There's a risk involved there, and you might harm students, and you just can't do that. You're probably just trying to have a capitalist takeover of the system, and that's not right. And I would try to remind them the current system is quite unequitable. There's a lot of really bad outcomes. And so by doing nothing, we are putting a lot of students at risk. And so what's the way to balance this? And I think we think that the way to do that is to make sure that you have all the voices at the table. You need to have all the stakeholders, the current incumbents, as I said, the people who are going to be building the new, bring the students in, and really have all of those folks at the table building this together, being really student-centered.
That's great. So Ryan, let me turn to you. So you have really prioritized this work in all that you write about, all that you speak about. In fact, you even changed the name of your company from University Ventures, right, to Achieve Partners. So it could talk a little bit about that shift in priority and how you've refocused your mission to really look at these pathways.
Yeah, I mean, we had a front row seat for the last decade, investing in a whole wide range of models to better connect the education ecosystem with employers and employment, and became convinced that it's not only a skills gap, it's also an experience gap. And that's very difficult for a school or training program or boot camp or college or university to solve on their own. In fact, it's very difficult for anyone except an employer to solve. So we changed strategies and began buying employers. We began buying employers and adding last mile training to what they do to become essentially large-scale apprenticeship programs. So we have done it in software development, data analytics, medical devices, insurance, healthcare IT, Salesforce, cybersecurity, instructional design. So these are all in separate companies that we have bought and are transforming into what we call it talent as a service, where they are delivering talent at scale to their clients and becoming engines of new talent. And in so doing, they become engines of career launch, essentially. And you know, your language around risk, we use the term friction to refer to that. There's too much friction built into the current system. If someone is seeking to become upskilled, they're being asked to take a financial risk. That's friction. By paying tuition, they're being asked to take an employment risk because no one's guaranteeing them a job. And so we're starting with the model that is time-tested, where there's no friction, which is an apprenticeship where you're hired from day one of training. Now, there are going to be other models, other intermediary-led models that maybe have a little more friction than that, right? An apprenticeship service provider model, boot camp type models, and we're in favor of all of them. So on the side, in all my spare time, I'm a founding board member of a new organization called Apprenticeships for America, where the goal is to recognize the centrality of the intermediary in this process and encourage the emergence of hopefully thousands of new intermediaries to launch these effectively new apprenticeship models. That's what we need. And if you look at other countries like the UK and Australia, who have done a lot in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of expanding apprenticeships beyond the industrial and construction trades It's because the governments have policies that effectively promote and provide funding for intermediaries that are organizing and selling apprenticeships to employers. So in my view, that's the primary answer. It's not the only answer, but it's the answer that is most equitable because an apprenticeship truly levels the playing field.
Yeah. And so, Jason, let me turn to you. We cannot buy all companies and turn them into apprenticeships. If that were the easy way to solve the problem, then we would do that. From your perspective, how do we get employers more engaged and more open to this idea of hiring from a diversity of pathways? First of all, does the research ring true from what you're hearing from employers that there is this willingness, but they're either internal practices or HR priorities might not be there yet? How do we get more employers to really engage in this process?
And thank you, Julie. We really appreciate being invited to be part of this panel and discussion. So for those of you who may not know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents a federation of over 1,500 state and local chambers of commerce across the country, American chambers of commerce globally, and collectively our federation reaches over 3 million firms. Our bread and butter is the small to mid-sized enterprises, which make up the largest job creators. So we got a tremendous reach, and when we've been doing this work on the foundation side, what we first tapped into is the demand. And I would say the research validates the demand that we've been hearing from our membership, which is they are hungry for alternatives. They are hungry for more skills-based hiring. But what we discovered in the work that we've done is it's a change management culture that needs to take place, and it's also capacity building. So we've gone out now and have been starting to really build a skill set in the private sector so they could effectively operationalize talent supply chains. It's more than a metaphor. It's a set of strategies, tools, and practices that make for an end-to-end process that's authentically employer-led and actually builds preferred provider networks, including alternative providers and pathways. So it's not just saying, convincing them, shouldn't you do it, because it's the right thing to do, it's teaching them how to do it, and how to do it well in a way that de-risks the pipeline. So we actually like the risk language. In our organization, we say you're going to have a better appetite and experience for alternative pathways if you de-risk the pipeline, and you could do that by having intentionality and going through a change management process like the one we provide. But there's others like it. But we provide a framework that was built by business for business that could really help them co-design these alternative pathways, including earn-to-learn pathways, the kind that Ryan's been talking about. So we're a big fan of the types of intermediaries that Ryan's setting up. They're great kinds of providers to be within one of our talent supply chains, but we're agnostic. And what we're trying to do is really build a skill set and mindset and a change management culture inside companies to really be much more intentional about co-designing and participating in owning these pathways and tracking the ROI associated with them. So it's going to take 1,000 conversations or more, but we've already been planting those seeds. We're building the training, we're building the quality assurance mechanisms to really stand that up. So as Ryan's trying to say, we need 1,000 models like this, we're trying to do our part within the private sector to make sure the demand aggregation is there to really help operationalize those 1,000 partnerships to build these alternative pathways.
And in some companies, it may take 1,000 conversation within that one company.
Absolutely.
To affect change.
Yeah, and then that's therein lies the challenge, right? So Pat, let's turn to you. So when it comes to the issue of risk, Credly really tries to sort of demystify this process for employers and give them an assurance that what the credential types that their prospective employees have value. Can you just talk a little bit about how you do that and how you work with employers to make sure they understand this process?
Sure, great. And thank you for this is a very interesting conversation and a perfect storm, I think, at this juncture. So for those who are not aware, Credly is the largest digital credential issuing platform out there, issuing now at this point over 51 million skills-based, resume-worthy signals of what someone knows and what they can do, says who, which is directly counter to that work of fiction known as LinkedIn. So giving that opportunity.
You wouldn't be saying that if LinkedIn had bought you.
Well, but Ryan, okay. So, but this is our opportunity in terms of improving that kind of communication, because this is a huge change management issue, and our role here is about providing communication, connection, and insight. So the organizations that we work with who are interested in starting to recognize the skills that have been acquired by their employees, and we're talking about incoming as well as incumbent employees, to be able to recognize skills, because this is now a pivot to a skills-based language and a skills-based economy. Well, how do you then put that, thumbprint on your forehead as to what skills that you have, to be able to match up to current opportunities, the job you have now and the job you want next, and the job that hasn't even been defined yet. So how do you inventory those particular skills and recognize them? More often than not these days, we're finding the need for having a maturity conversation with organizations. Because just because you can issue a digital credential for something doesn't necessarily mean you should. So it's important to be able to have that discussion about the granularity of what is the skill that's being recognized? What value does it have? What's the who cares and so what? Once you have issued that recognition to the individual, how does that improve their ability to be able to progress? And how does it improve the organization's ability to have better insight in terms of the skill set it has in its talent community that's there? So we get this very interesting connective tissue responsibility, connecting the issuer who's sending those signals, the earner who needs to now be an HR department of one to advocate for themselves, but need a tool that is not just one line on a piece of paper, but rather deep, rich metadata to describe not only the criteria of what they went through to be able to earn the recognitions, but specifically the skills that they're being recognized for, so that they can then have the power to connect to opportunities themselves, as well as, I say, disclose their opportunities, but also be discovered.
Yeah.
And then the community that takes a look at those credentials and says, what do I know now when I see this credential, but what do I look for when I want to search for that credential?
That's great. So, you talked a little bit about the ability to articulate the skills that you have and how you talk to employers about that. So maybe this is a question for you and for Jason. So what do you think is needed from an education standpoint in order for kids, for students, to better articulate the skills that they personally have, right? It's not just about an outside institution certifying their skills, but they need to be able to articulate to an employer the types of skills that they have. Do you think our education system is doing enough to help kids articulate those skills, and what more should we be doing in that space?
Great opportunity, a great upside for improvement. Let's just put it that way.
Very positive.
Exactly, and that's part of the value of having a digital credential, which is not that one line on a piece of paper, because it will help tell your story until such time as you can tell your story more comfortably. This discussion about skills and competencies and experience and that kind of thing is not necessarily the everyday language for someone who is going through that learning process. We talk about it here in this community easily, but helping someone be able to articulate and tell that particular story. We issue the National Honor Society digital credential and the National Junior Honor Society credential, and we talk about the fact this is the first positive social media asset that the individual student has, and the fact that it speaks to the skills recognized because they're a merit scholar is the first time for them to be able to talk about, oh, I went through this experience and here's how I can accurately describe it, but do so articulately using the detail that's within the digital credentials. So it's starting to recognize them for those particular skill sets and make practice. But a big part of our training process is to the guidance counselors and to the principals and to the community around them to teach them the language of skills.
Yeah, that's great.
I would add to that is we need better records and we need more records. There's learning happening all the time, and we're leaving it on the table. Or we privilege some learning settings over other learning settings. So you're talking about alternative pathways. We need to operationalize them, and that needs system-level infrastructure to support it. So if I'm getting a transcript, it better be competency or skill-based, so it better surfaces what I know and I'm able to do and can help me get a job or pursue continuing learning opportunities. If I'm in a community experience, if I'm learning at a library, if I'm learning on the job or through a work-based learning experience, there should be a transcript for that. I should be able to surface a collection of all of my various learning experiences as competencies or skills that I'm empowered with and I could then use to tell my story, or at least to better communicate what my qualifications are. Right now, we're putting all the onus on the individual to tell that story themselves, to gather all of this learning and put it in a resume, a Word document in one page or maybe two.
Right.
And it really puts them at a disadvantage. So we need to capture and document in a high-quality way all of the learning, link it to the individual, and that data should be working for them. It shouldn't be put incumbent upon any individual, not even anyone in this room, to have to completely tell your story when much of this is going to be read by machines. And if we can create machine actionable data about your experiences, your knowledge, your skills, your abilities, that could be accurately assessed for fit across a wide variety of pathways and opportunities, your data is working for you. And it's not this high stakes game of, can you accurately describe yourself in as few words as possible in order to be seen? So we need to have this system level change, but on the employer side, what we're talking about the chamber is we're saying, we want to, have some visionary thinking. Where might we be in 10 years? Employers are going to be the new educators. HR is going to be the new registrars. And LERs are going to be the new transcript. I'm not saying they're all going to be that, but you're going to have all of this documented learning that's already happening on the job for youth and adults that's going to be put in a document and linked to you. So that data is working for you. So I might have this exposure in the classroom, and we need to document that in a high-quality way. But if we start documenting all the life-wide and lifelong learning, that provides a significant opportunity for alternative pathways.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, this is really interesting. You have the signal here, and then you have the receivers here. And what you said about machine readable is absolutely the key, which is to bridge that gap from, new job seeker to good first job. It needs to be readable to applicant tracking systems and HRIS systems, because it's not the middle or the bottom of the hiring funnel that's broken, right? If I'm a interviewer, I'm actually talking to a candidate, I can see on the resume, I look at this, I can click on a digital credential, I can see what it means. So it's intelligible to me as a hiring manager. But the problem is I'm only seeing those candidates that make it through the top of the funnel. And right now that's happening entirely by machine. So it's this connection that needs to happen at the level of the machine.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that we asked specifically in the research was, is a bachelor's degree a requirement for hiring? So do people get sort of screened out from your process? A lot of employers said they did not believe it should be, but there was a still significant number that had it as a practice. So going back to that point, Jason, of it is internal change management that needs to happen. I think that's the research definitely bears out that is something that there's a big gap there. I think one of the questions that I have for this group of innovators, educators, what are some of the innovations that you think are necessary to sort of really spur progress in and push the industry forward? There has been so much disruption over the last 2 years. It's an enormous opportunity as well as a challenge to figure out how we capitalize on people's willingness to change their work environments, change their careers, possibly change the way they do things. Are there specific innovations in this space that you feel would really push us forward, sort of even blue sky, that you would like to see happen? Any or all of you?
I think for decades now we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars funding education and training pretty much blindly. And I'd like to see some small portion of that being directed to actually funding placement. So actually encourage employers and intermediaries to actually hire, to hire candidates, which would mean hiring candidates from alternative pathways effectively. And that's really how you bridge not just the skills gap, but the experience gap as well. I say it all the time. There are any number of ways in which a job seeker can become a newly, a Trailhead certified Salesforce administrator. Right? You can do it. It's free. It's asynchronous. You can pass the test. But how many employers are actively looking to hire newly certified Salesforce administrators who've never actually worked as a Salesforce administrator? So where are those employers? And that's a big part of the problem, is that for far too many entry-level jobs are seeking experience, or effectively experience already. And entry-level jobs have become an oxymoron in lots of fields. Cybersecurity is a perfect example. You look at all the requirements for an entry-level cybersecurity job, you effectively have had to work for 3 years in cybersecurity. So what's that pathway in? And again, it can't just be about solely education and training. It needs to be about providing real work experience.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think we would love to see a lot more of these training providers emerge. There's a lot of really exciting ones, many of whom are here at ASU+GSV, but there need to be a lot more. I think one of the things that is going to be required to make students hire, or students go to them and employers hire from them, is signals of quality. And so there needs to be a lot more innovation in that quality space. So there's metrics the federal government is collecting that might be helpful, but those are pretty blunt metrics. There's a lot more data that could be collected and released, and JFF has recently acquired EQUOS, the Educational Quality and Outcome Standards. I think I got that acronym right. But to really be able to examine quality on a much more granular level. And so we want to be able to make that information available to students and to employers. And like one of the other things that we saw in the research was that the programs that students were gravitating towards and that employers were hiring from were the ones that had name brands attached to them. So the Google IT Support Certificate was one of the examples. And again, it's like status in higher ed. It's like, well, we don't really know which ones are good, so you can't go wrong hiring someone from Harvard. And so we want that not to be replicated in this new pathways space. So how can we provide better qualities, better signals of quality?
Right, because it really comes down to that name brand. Jason, do you have?
Yeah, I want to, so I think there's many more than this, but I'd like to focus us on 3 innovations. And one builds off what David was just suggesting. Quality assurance is one of them. 9 times out of 10, someone's going to shut the conversation down around alternative pathways because they're going to say, we have no way of knowing if they're quality or not. Right. And that just shuts everything down. So let's solve that. We can build alternative quality assurance systems. Business community has them. It's the ISO system. It operates global supply chains. We just haven't done it for human capital. But there's alternative approaches to how you can assure the quality of a pathway that should get us past that point. So that's one. Number 2 is what I previously mentioned, which is the data infrastructure. If learning is happening, that learning has to be documented and made transparent. That has to happen. And then number 3 is the incentives. You have to have the incentives to be able to operationalize those pathways. Right now, you have all of this loan and grant money flowing as incentives to certain pathways. But if we were to have a more expansive quality assurance system, imagine what we could do if even a 10th of those resources that are currently available were able to flow to alternative pathways. It could really disrupt the market. And think about that for employer incentives. We often talk about, the coin of the realm being federal grants and loans, but employers are putting out over $30 billion in tuition assistance every year, and it's one of the least utilized benefits. I just had a conversation with Sherman the other day about really trying to disrupt employee benefits in the education space, and let's go from $30 billion to $60 billion. Let's go for $100 billion. We can do this. But money moves markets, as I'm sure Ryan could educate us on. And we need to think through how we're going to get these system-level pieces in place so they're no longer alternative pathways. They're just pathways, right. And there's no wrong pathway.
Well, that's one of the things that we're trying to change in the work is that we're not using the word alternative anymore. A diversity of pathways. We don't want to continue to perpetuate that.
Let's kill the term alternative and just say it's a credential.
It's a path.
Okay?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So it's a recognition. Note, yes to all of this, and we're again, it gets back to the point in terms of where we are in the maturity of this idea. We've got decades of experience that says, if this person comes from this particular profile of a education institution or, all the usual signals that someone is relying upon, that data is something that they're hanging their hat on in terms of, well, I can trust and verify based on that statistical background information. You're introducing an entirely new thought here in terms of saying, I'm looking at a different kind of credential than the traditional one that I've been looking at. How can we accelerate the way to be able to show the outcomes, to be able to, just as your research had put forward, 80+% of executives are saying you should hire someone who has, but we should also drink more water and eat vegetables, and we don't necessarily do that either. So what kind of incentives can we put in place to encourage them of saying, what's the percent of employees that you are relying on additional or different credentials to be able to hire, and how can we map better to outcomes? Because outcomes are some of the data that people will then start to trust more, that says, oh, I should hire 50% of my staff not relying on an undergraduate degree, but where's my proof point? What's my longevity and the long tail of data that we have to be able to show that they actually do perform in a way that gives them that trust of saying, okay, I can go there now.
Right.
So I think that's more and more that's moving in that direction between LER discussions and as well as data mapping and just empowering workforce managers inside organizations on how to be able to make more data-based talent management decisions based on all the skills that you can now map.
Yeah, Jason and Ryan, do you see any organizations that are doing this particularly well right now that should be sort of applauded and lauded for their good work?
Around data?
Yeah.
I mean, there are a bunch of them that are focused on this, but no, I mean, it's all small scale at this point. I think, look, I want to make one more point, which is Jason is truly doing God's work because changing employer behavior is really, if you think changing higher education behavior is hard, changing employer behavior and HR behavior is really hard. And I'll cite as an example our company Readable, where when we built our first hire, train, deploy model for software developers, where there's no risk to the employer because we're literally serving up talent to them and saying, do you want them on a staffed basis? We'll remain the employer of record. There's no risk to you. Initially, all they wanted were CS grads from top 50 universities, even though there was no risk to them. But then a couple years down the road, fully 1/3 of the software developers who were being staffed were out of community colleges. And one reason was the Readable model. There's no risk to the employer. They can always send a resource back. But the second reason is that it's they began to trust Readable. That Readable said this resource can do the work. And so that's that was like 3 years in the making to make that happen at a series of employers. It's
But it's
hard
a
even when
cultural
there's no
change,
risk.
right? It's really a cultural change.
It is. They're used to hiring a certain way. They're used to recruiting at certain schools, and no one's going to get hired or no one's going to get promoted for adapting, but people get fired if they make the wrong decision. So it is a risk of, I think HR. Correct me if I'm wrong, fellow panelists, but HR is one of the more risk-averse parts, and often acts as a compliance regulatory function more than a talent promoting innovation function.
Yeah. Jason, do you see any employers that are really stepping up and making changes that we should be looking towards, we should be looking to replicate? Is there anyone particularly good out there doing this work?
Yeah, I would go to like our exemplars in our talent supply chain networks. I mean, these are the folks who've adopted a change management framework, who are implementing it in a methodic way and really building these new practices inside companies. But it is still emerging work. I mean, we've been at this for 6+ years, and we're in 39 states in Canada, but if you look at our reach, it's probably just north of like 3,000 employers right now. Significant for this space to kind of grow that rapidly and in a sustainable way, but we got a long way to go.
Yeah.
So this is going to be the long haul. But we're now trying to build new training management platforms. In fact, we're now a client of Credly's, where we're going to be credentialing professionals inside employers, inside HR and workforce development on how to operate talent supply chains.
That's great.
And we're going to try to facilitate this at scale so they do become much more sophisticated customers of alternative pathways. So we're going to do the hard work. And we do have some really good exemplars we could point to, some great companies in Michigan and Kentucky that we've worked to, down in Houston that have just done incredible work in Phoenix. Right next door. In fact, we have a partnership here with the Economic Development Group in San Diego that has built talent supply chains here in this very community. So we can definitely put you in touch with some folks, but what we got to move past is boutique. And when I started this work at the U.S. Chamber, I said, look, we can't just do 7 pilots here, 7 pilots there. That's not how, that does not a system grow. We need to start learning and seeding, but always with an eye towards scale.
Yeah.
And that scale is not only addressing the big technology gaps, but it's the human side, which is the biggest problem of all. And you can give them all the outcomes data they want, which is important, but unless they get the experience themselves and get comfortable with the new process, that's when you start getting real momentum inside of an organization. So it's the long path, but you got a heck of a lot of people pulling in the right direction right now, and they're coming up with some really novel solutions that can help scale this faster.
That's great. Back to your point of the government moving slowly. Sometimes it's a good thing. How do we put appropriate safeguards in to minimize unintended consequences of change, really, and really helping people understand that those safeguards are in place so that they are willing to move?
Yeah, I think this is where you've got to both, you got to think big and imagine big, but like act small, and you got to move where the data is actually there. And so that's why you've got to build the data systems that are going to enable that and enable people to move it where it actually makes sense. And I think actually I'm looking at Rahul with the morning consult data, and it's sort of another plug for tomorrow. There's a lot more data about HR managers and how their perceptions are different from the rest of the companies. So that's just one thing I wanted to say.
Yeah,
Something else just occurred to me, which is that we're, all our hire, train, deploy pathways are successful in large part because they're very selective. So we can begin to change employer behavior by selling them on this alternative pathway with a highly selective cohort, right? Sort of the opposite of what your for-profit university open enrollment model is, or if you will, maybe some of the coding bootcamp models as well. So I think that's an important consideration, that if you're going to change employer behavior, you have to lead with top talent and begin to really sell them on the notion of this alternative pathway rather than just simply, throwing an open enrollment alternative pathway at them and hoping that some will stick, because that's not going to cut it.
Right.
Sorry, and actually, I realized I didn't answer your question about the government. I do think that there's a lot of data that the federal government collects, and they're not really using it in exactly the right way right now. So there's the Department of Education, there's all the IPEDS data, college scorecard data. There's also a lot of data at the Department of Labor. And we, with the ECMC group, wrote a letter to the Department of Education saying, these are all the different data sources you could look at. And so I think that from the federal government...
And are they well coordinated, or
they're not.
Yeah.
And I know from working in the federal government that they certainly aren't. But there was an openness to doing that. And there was an openness to working with their colleagues. We had a panel earlier today with colleagues from the Department of Education, Commerce, and Labor, and they have weekly meetings and they're talking to each other. So I do think that there's glimmers of hope there. We have a little bit of a blueprint that we said, you all should try looking at these metrics here.
That's exciting.
So yeah, I have a little bit more optimism than I might have a few months ago.
Excellent. Go ahead, Jason.
If I could add to that, the one issue that we need to confront when it comes to federal policy is, you're putting over $150 million in loans annually. Billion, sorry. 30 billion in Pell Grants on a good year. Follow the money. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to put that amount of incentives into a system that's only going to reinforce traditional pathways, that's what you're going to get. And I really like what you said earlier, David, which is what if we don't change? Yeah. Where's the standard here? It's, can we do better than we're at right now? And that's not going to take too much. So we got to have a little bit more of a spirit of innovation there. We have to understand that the incentives need to flow in other directions if we're actually going to learn, if we can raise the bar and get better outcomes. But we got to take on that incentives issue, because you look at things like, I was just having a conversation with some of our Credly colleagues outside about what are some employer perspectives around registered apprenticeship. We have many employers in our members that like registered apprenticeship, federally registered apprenticeship, but it's still very boutique. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you actually want to scale that pathway, you need to start talking about all kinds of earn and learn pathways, which carry the name apprenticeship or not, and make sure those could be incentivized, because right now there is no financial incentive to do it.
Right.
So unless we get the incentives right for alternative pathways, we're not going to have as many employers participating in them, but we're not going to have learners trusting them either, because if I'm not allowed to use my resources to pursue those pathways, that tells me something.
Right, absolutely.
So we got to take on the incentives issue, and I agree, we want to be cautious and not make big changes too fast, but we have to make some kind of change, because we can't dump that kind of volume of cash into the system and expect people to behave differently.
Yeah, it says something if if the federal government says, I cannot use my Pell Grant for that. It says something about quality that I think you're...
No, I mean, the challenge is that one of the sad legacies of for-profit colleges is that the Democratic Party is allergic to making education and workforce funding available to for-profit entities, which would include employers. So there we go.
Can I ask a question? I saw on Twitter, Ryan, that you were you were saying things about ISAs. So for some people, they thought that was going to be the savior
Right.
for these, and maybe you've changed heart.
No, I mean, I think they're dead, but I think that was the case of this ridiculous article where someone's ISA is now $100,000, but it's because they're making a lot of money. And they didn't even, the article just their ISA is now $100,000. Well, it's because they're probably making $150,000 right out of college. So that's what it made. So, but anyway, it's dead as a result. And I think, again, that's part of the fact that the Democratic Party has become allergic to sort of entities, instruments that for-profit companies are involved in the education workforce landscape. And there's good reasons for that, but then there are casualties of that. And a lot of these pathways that we're talking about are going to have to be private sector pathways if they're going to scale.
So one final question while we end. The ultimate goal of this work with JFF is to really drive conversation around a diversity of post-secondary education pathways. So from each of you, I'd love to hear what the most common sort of misunderstanding or misinformation that's floating around about diverse pathways that we need to combat in this.
I think that this isn't for my kids. This is for someone else's kids, and we need to let people understand that this could be for anyone, for all kids.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of my last book was that these are not just for blue-collar, welding and electrician jobs. There was an index of 300 different programs that were tech and healthcare and financial services jobs, good jobs that college grads are having trouble getting because they're not getting these skills.
Yep, we can't look at these pathways as less than. They have to be seen as mainstream. They have to be embraced, and that means we all need to start practicing what we preach if we believe in them. Like we had, there was a question I posed in a prior panel where we were getting really jazzed about like skills-based hiring and changing employer practices. I said the education sector is an employer too. Where are they in adopting this kind of change management and these kinds of hiring practices? Because you're going to run into all these barriers and friction that we run into. So I think we all need to take a hard look in the mirror, and this isn't about what someone else should be doing. If we believe in alternative pathways, we should be operationalizing them within our own organizations.
And I think underscoring all of this is being able to make the communication about what is involved in that pathway. Going through the traditional process of getting an undergraduate degree and everyone understands that model. There's not enough universal understanding in terms of what is a possible living wage, positive career success possible if one takes a path other than I'm going to go to and get a 4-year degree. We need more examples in that are other than some of the skilled trades and those kind of things that are available out there, because it's still kind of viewed in that way.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Rapid fire session, but we appreciate your time and attention. Have a good afternoon, everyone.